Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, fueling philanthropic programs and dedicated to creating educational and professional opportunities for Alaska Native people.
The National Weather Service.
And good Monday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service. It's the 9th of May, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information at weather.gov/Alaska or /Anchorage/Fairbanks or /Juneau to get into your local information even more. The Weather Info line is open at 800-472-0391, and you can find more information during the day on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. Of course, in the afternoon around 4 o'clock, if you go to NWS Anchorage on YouTube, you'll be able to find your daily afternoon map briefing. It's the same radio broadcast that you'll hear on Alaska Public Radios and other stations across the state, so you can see the maps along with that voice anytime you want and get a sneak peek of what you're going to see here later on the show. If you're listening today, we did talk about flood watches that were posted across the south-facing slopes of the northwestern Brooks Range, as well as the interior portions of the Seward Peninsula and southern coastline. The reason being is a very strong and slow-moving southerly section of wind will be working its way northward. That's going to bring heat and moisture, and it looks like it's really going to focus on putting down about 2 to 3 inches of rain potentially in this area. That's just the first part of the week. And with that, of course, we still have snow and ice in these areas, and that could create significant melt if it warms up a lot, but it's also going to create some pretty quick runoff. So we'll be watching for flooding in the coming days. So a flood watch is posted. That does include the Nome area, as well as Ambler and Bettles and the Noatak and Kobuk valleys there. So keep that in mind as you're moving around in the south-facing slopes of the northwestern Brooks Range, as well as the interior of the Seward Peninsula and the southern coastline of the Seward Peninsula, including Nome. Now in those areas, you can see, as you look at the satellite picture, a pretty hefty run of those southerly winds as that works up across the YK Delta and across the Seward Peninsula. This bright white area is what we're going to focus on. Here's the area of low pressure out to the west, and this is going to channel this a little bit further northward as we go ahead in time from Tuesday into Wednesday and probably Thursday. After Thursday, there seems to be another surge that'll work its way northward, so we'll be watching that. But right now, we're really focused on that first wave. As that sets up tonight and tomorrow, it's already raining, but it'll probably rain more. Some of that could be moderate to occasionally heavy rainfall in this region. So once again, 2 to 3 inches of rain looks to be fairly possible at this point. Looking at the rest of the region, you can see one area of low pressure is already working through as that drags more moisture north and east. This is what was working through south central and many areas in the northern Susitna Valley and the Alaska Range into the Tanana Valley earlier this afternoon. The skies were clearing up from southwest to north and east, and there's still going to be some rainfall across the Alcan border and southward into northern sections of southeast, but even this should be decreasing as we go into the next 24 hours. High pressure setting up, and if you look carefully, you can start to see more and more of these darker clouds showing up. Those are lower clouds in the atmosphere. The bright white ones are the highest. And as this moves over south central, the interior, and even parts of southeast, the weather is going to get spectacular. In some cases, temperatures in the interior could surpass 60 degrees, maybe even head towards 70. So there are going to be some pretty warm spots in the interior tomorrow. And while that will dry things up and probably won't help fire danger very much, the other side of that coin is very wet and slow-moving weather across the northwestern parts of the Brooks Range and the Seward Peninsula, where we're talking about that heavier rainfall. High pressure is setting up across the Gulf right now at 1,033 millibars. You can see low pressure across the Bering at 979. This frontal boundary represents that changeover and that focusing mechanism that's going to put a lot of that wet weather right up the west coast. So watch for it to start raining and then probably stay raining on and off for quite a bit into the midweek. Up north, we have a stalled boundary there along the Arctic coast. Really not much to write home about, but something I did see today was some showers and maybe even a thunderstorm popping up there. Might draw a question mark around that. If you heard thunder, that's probably what it was. Not entirely sure, though, that that actually was a true thing. Out across the interior, we did see some pockets of rainfall today. Most of that was fairly light, and you can already see the sun clearing up the clouds around the Barren Islands, southward of Calgon Island, and out toward Kodiak Island today as high pressure is squashing the cloud development for the rest of the afternoon. As we go into tonight, we're going to watch for showers across the interior. It doesn't look like there's a really good focus for thunderstorm activity tonight as there has been for earlier last week. Rainfall is starting to set up across the northern part of the Yukon Delta into Norton Sound, Seward Peninsula, and many areas in the Kotzebue Sound region. You'll notice it's still warm enough for rainfall across the west, but it's also still cold enough for rain and snow showers to mix across the central and northern Bering Sea and snow showers across the Gulf of Vanderdeer. A look further eastward shows showers are possible across the Tanana Valley, and there's still going to be some clouds around, but south of that, as high pressure starts to get its grips on many in the Copper River Basin, south central, Cook Inlet, all the way down to Kodiak Island, we'll probably start to see some fog in the region. It's hard to say how widespread that's going to be just yet, but it does look like there's that opportunity. So morning aviators and early commuters and anybody jumping on the boat right away, don't be surprised if visibility is down just a little bit in the morning. For southeast, watch for clouds across parts of the central and southern regions, and maybe still a few lingering showers up north, but even that looks to improve as we go into Tuesday. A couple showers may pop up, but overall, high pressure is in charge at 1,036 millibars. There could still be some low stratus and clouds across the northern Gulf. A few areas of light rain may linger around Kodiak Island thanks to that southerly flow. But by and large, if you're going to talk about rain tomorrow, it looks like it will be out across the western Brooks Range and part of the Seward Peninsula, and especially if you're pointed southward, so plan on getting wet there. Rain and snow showers will be a little bit further west. Everything we see from St. Matthew to the Pribilofs to the Aleutians to the Alaska Peninsula looks like it's going to fall in liquid form, and that's not a mistake that we drew that far north. It is going to be a very warm system working across the west. Now, for as wet as that is, it's going to be a lot drier to the east, and you'll see improving conditions across the interior, but it doesn't look like a very good chance for rain or thunder at this point. As we go into Wednesday, notice there's very little changes there. Southeast is still predominantly dry. High pressure is pretty much in the same place, and that channel of moisture is still sitting in the same old spot across the west coast and even into the interior a little bit, across the lower and middle Yukon Valley to the Kobuk and Noatak and the Seward Peninsula and the YK Delta. So plan on being a little soggy as we go into Wednesday. Rain and snow is possible for St. Lawrence Island and part of Nunivak Island. The Pribilofs will be a little bit drier. Don't be surprised to pick up a shower here, but Wednesday I think you'll see more clouds than anything else. High pressure still in charge of the Yukon and parts of British Columbia, and most of southeast at this point. It looks pretty dry going into the midweek. There is more rain as we get into Thursday and Friday for parts of the west. Temperatures today were in the 40s and 50s for parts of southeast. As you get down toward Ketchikan, temps were already over 60 degrees in some parts this afternoon. Copper River Basin made it into the 40s around Gulkana, 51 in Anchorage. Upper 40s for Talkeetna, Squentna, and around Rainy Pass, 45 there. 57 for Fairbanks. It was 60 in Eagle this afternoon. A little bit cooler down the road in Northway at 48. Fort Yukon saw 59. The North Slope was in the 20s and 30s. 46 for Anaktuvuk Pass and Arctic Village, only 27 in Barrow, 39 in Wainwright, 30s and 40s for a part of Kotzebue Sound, 37 in Shishmaref, 39 in Nome, 51 in Galena, 52 in McGrath. Heading down the river, it was 43 in Amonuk, 41 in Nunivak Island. St. Lawrence Island, only 37. And looked like out across eastern Russia, only 36 degrees there. Grayling saw temps in the mid-50s. Around Bristol Bay, above 50 degrees for both Dillingham and King Salmon. Around the Alaska Peninsula, lower to mid-40s there. Sandpoint showed 46. Dutch Harbor and Unalaska, 44. 42 for both St. Paul and St. George. And lower 40s for Kiska, Attu, all the way up for Adak and Atka as well. Now, we had a little bit of trouble, as you may have seen on the website today. Some of our imagery wasn't working quite right. Well, when that happens, sometimes it runs on over into the TV desk maps too. So we got old school. How many of you remember us drawing maps like this just a couple of years ago? Not that long, right? Well, we went back to the well there and did it like we used to do it, and so we got a little different map for you tonight. Hopefully we'll get the old stuff back in gear. 30s and 40s for most of the interior and southwest, 40s there for the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, lower 40s for most of southeast, and 20s and 30s for the North Slope, with most of the Seward Peninsula staying warm. thanks to that warm and wet air working up the west coast. No surprise there. Look at this. High temperatures tomorrow in the interior could easily make it into the 60s. Don't be surprised if that thermometer shows you 70, maybe even low 70s tomorrow and Wednesday. It is going to be fairly warm across a large part of the interior tomorrow. Out across the west, 50s for Southwest, the Seward Peninsula, 40s for some of the higher terrain, and places in the Kobuk and Noatak valleys will also be a little bit on that upper 40s to about 50-degree side there as that warm and wet air hits the higher terrain and probably rains. So it will be cool and cloudy and wet, but it should be warmer than it has been. For southeast, look for temperatures to range from the 50s to about 60 degrees down across southern parts of southeast tomorrow. On to flying weather, IFR conditions are expected across the Arctic coast through the Bering Strait, Nunivak Island, and westward. Also expecting IFR across the Kodiak Island region southward toward about Sand Point, with some of our passes in the western Alaska Range starting at IFR, and you'll see mainly MVFR across part of southeast. That improves quickly tomorrow afternoon. IFR lingers across the Pacific coastline of the Alaska Peninsula to about Akiak. Watch for IFR to hold across the western Alaska Range with MVFR all the way up to about Rainy Pass, but much improvement across south central and the Cook Inlet region. And you'll notice many across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range still holding on to MVFR, and watch for occasional IFR there during the day thanks to the rainfall. Here's your pass conditions. IFR to start in Anaktuvuk Pass, leaning over to MVFR as the day goes on. We expect similar improvements in Adigan Pass throughout the daytime on Tuesday. For Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, IFR conditions there, hoping for some improvements to MVFR. Don't be surprised, though, if you pop out on the west side and just run into rain for most of the way. A Rainy Pass expecting IFR conditions through the morning hours with MVFR expected by the afternoon. VFR conditions and improvement noted in Windy Pass tomorrow. Isabel Pass also expected to start down low and then end up better at VFR through the afternoon. Isabel Pass, again, VFR conditions are expected there. Tanita Pass, VFR by the afternoon. We expect to see Portage Pass starting at MVFR, but improvements shown there. And Chilkoot and White Pass, VFR conditions are expected by the afternoon and should hold until we get into Wednesday there with maybe a little bit of morning fog. Freezing levels, wow, what a mess. 2,000 to 4,000 foot levels there across the west coast. You can see a quick run up to very warm air, 4, 6, and even 8,000 foot lines across parts of southeast here. The surface freezing line holding over the upper Yukon Valley as well as the areas south and east into the Copper River Basin, and the surface freezing line up north. That's the key right here. Look at this, way north of the Brooks Range. Oh, chances are we're going to start to see some melting on the northern rivers as well. So if that affects you, keep watch on that. Icing potential shows areas of light to isolated moderate developing about 5,000 to 6,000 feet and above, and mainly across southwestern Alaska through Bristol Bay and part of the Alaska Peninsula, maybe the western Alaska Range as well. Again, this is very warm air. This is going to be moving northward in the coming days, so watch for that, and we'll see how the areas of lift develop. If there's increased areas of cold air, that might run up to occasional. Your pilot reports also help that, so make sure you file those and pass on that information as you do. The jet stream shows low pressure out across the Bering, and with the circulation, notice that upward bent of that fast-moving river of air right here across the west. Now, is there any guess why we're seeing that very wet weather playing out here across the northwestern Brooks Range and the interior of the Seward Peninsula? This is grabbing that warm and wet air and putting it right here. So blowing it into the higher terrain, that's exactly what you've got. Wind speeds there over south and western Alaska up to 125 knots. Not only do we have the air moving in the right direction, but we're energizing it with that extra speed at 125 knots. On the other side of that, we have more of a northwest to southeasterly flow descending into the lower 48 states. That's helping to develop a ridge of high pressure here across south central and the interior to keep things fairly quiet. And you'll notice it's already building even further north, so we're driving that warmth far across the north slope. At 9,000 feet, southerlies there, 50 to 60 knots across the west, a little bit slower across south central. Into the interior, though, wind speeds there around 30 to 40 knots, so it's not like things are really slow across the interior as they were last week. Northwesterlies coming down across southeast at 15 to 20 knots, and way out across the west, northerlies are working into the central and western Aleutians, but they slow down significantly, only about 25 knots there once they reach over the islands. At 3,000 feet, wind speeds staying up at about 10, 20, even 30 knots here across the interior. And then once you get west of the Alaska Range, they pick up to about 30, 40, even 50 knots in a few isolated cases. Southerlies across the Bering Sea and the open water there about 25 to 30. So you can see this is a long and wide fetch of southerly winds. And then we get back into our slower north and westerly winds coming over southeast. High pressure here sitting across the Gulf. It is in no mood to move on quickly. Turbulence potential then shows that light to isolated moderate is possible across the western Brooks Range on top of poor visibility. Probably not the best place to fly tomorrow. And across Norton Sound through the YK Delta into Bristol Bay and westward into the eastern chain below 4,000 feet. Some of that could reach occasional moderate over the Killbucks and into Bristol Bay. So keep watch on that and fly safe tomorrow. We'll be back with a look at your sea ice edge in just a few minutes, as well as the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Good evening, I'm Harry Keeling, and on behalf of Alaska Public Media and the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation, welcome to Hangar Flying. Last time we had a young lady on our program, Jen Armstrong, and we talked a little bit about some of her business, which is unmanned aircraft. We also talked about her background, having graduated from the Air Force Academy and done a lot of things. One of the areas that we didn't really talk too much about was her career now as an Alaska Air Guard C-130 pilot. Welcome back, Jen.
Thank you for having me.
So, talk a little bit about flying the C-130 in Alaska, well, and around the world.
I love it. I consider it one of the last big airplanes, at least for the military. You get to hand fly all the time, and you can strategically provide transport all over the world. You can long-haul missions, and then you can also perform the tactical low-level airdrop missions as well. So it's kind of a pilot's airplane.
And I've always said that being in the Guard in Alaska's got to be special too, huh?
It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, I think we're all pretty excited about living here and getting outdoors and enjoying the mountains, and we get to do that from the air. So it's the best of both worlds. A couple of specific questions I want to ask you related to safety. One of them is, you guys obviously take off and fly around the bowl a lot. You go to Malamute. You know, you're in the air. Do you have any thoughts that you would share with the general aviation pilots out there on maybe how we could collectively do that safer? Sure, and you're absolutely right. Our training area, we're trying to fit in as much as we can into a 2-hour sortie, involves us taking off of Elmendorf, flying a low level, and when I say low level, I mean C-130s and C-17s are typically between 300 and 500 feet AGL, helicopters even lower, and so we'll be anywhere, we call it the Susitna Valley, and so anywhere from Anchorage to Mount Sioux, up to Talkeetna, and then into the drop zone area as well. So that's where you can find us operating. It could be a single C-130, it could be a formation, 4 or 6 C-130s at one time operating at that level. So I guess my advice to the community would be that, hey, this is where we are. Please turn your transponders on. That's how we see you. Even if you're not talking to ATC, we have TCAS, we have skin paint. If you have a transponder, it gives us amazing SA as far as if you're out in that area flying, or even really anywhere in the state of Alaska. We flew up over by Lake George just the other day, and someone had their transponder on, and so we were able to see them that we might not have otherwise been able to see the general aviation plane flying along there. And then be up CTAF frequency. We're always up on there announcing our position reports and just announcing big geographical locations where we're flying, and hopefully some people are listening out there.
Good words, and I hope people are listening. And I would add to that, to emphasize what you said. If you are flying along feet wet and you are outside the restricted area, you're not out of danger. And if you're not listening to approach control, you're not going to hear about the 130s or C-17s that are coming in, perfectly legal, to Malamute at jump altitude. So the opportunities are there. So thanks for that advice. Along a similar line, what one thing would you suggest that we could do to make flying safer in Alaska?
There's a lot of ways you can make flying safer. One thing that we do pretty well, I think, is come up with risk mitigation plans in the way of operational risk analysis or crew coordination items, meaning
and I think this would go across both lines of military and general aviation flying, is, you know, we brief at almost nauseum, hey, this is the plan, this is what I expect from you, here's our limitations for today, here's my personal limitations, here's our crew limitations, and then we hold each other accountable for that plan and those limitations. So essentially, I guess big picture would be ask yourself what if in the general aviation world, you know, what if something bad happens, or what if the weather isn't as I predicted or forecasted? Come up with ways that you're going to mitigate that risk, and then also communicate that plan to whoever you're flying with, or maybe someone at home. Communicate that risk analysis plan to mitigate the risk, and then hold yourself accountable. Communicating that plan allows people to say, hey, Billy Bob, I thought you said we were going to turn around if the weather was such and such, or hey, you said we were going to fly no later than this time of day. You know, at least addressing the limitations that you set for yourself. So if we apply that across the board of our activities, whether it's a military mission or if it's a, hey, I want to go fly out to my cabin today or this week, I think if we implement those simple, just very simple things into our planning and execution, then we'd all be a little bit safer and always come back.
Thank you for those words. Hey, one last quick question. Someone wants to join the Guard. Who do they call?
We have some very good recruiters out there, and you can just Google Alaska Air National Guard recruiters, and I'm sure you'd be able to quickly get someone to answer any of your questions. You know, the Alaska Air National Guard is one of the largest operations groups in the inventory. We have a lot of missions out there, a lot of airplanes. We have a lot of people doing some really good things, and I'm sure they'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Great. Jen, thanks for being on the program. Thanks for your service. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. Until next time, fly safe.
Thanks, Harry. We'll see you again on Friday. Here's a look at the sea ice edge now and what's left of it across the Bering Sea. That warm and wet air that's moving up the west coast has also been working to destroy the ice across northern sections of the Bering, certainly inside of Norton Sound. And a lot of what you see here looks solid by its color. It all is shaded blue or white. White, of course, is above 80% concentration. But if you look at it like that, that's really not a whole lot of surface area that's covered up by highly concentrated ice. Everything else that is either in dark blue is open. If it is light blue, it's 80% or below. And I got to tell you, I looked at a lot of these specific areas today in detail, and it's a lot lower than 80%. It's probably 20, 30, 40, 50% at best. So a lot of changes here across the northern Bering Sea. Now, changes are starting up here across the Kotzebue Sound region. Watch for a lot of changes there later this week. And there is open water here off the Chukchi Sea coast. So more to come, especially after this very warm week coming up. Let's take a little bit of time and look at across southeastern Alaska. Northerlies coming down the inner channels there at 10 knots with a 2-foot sea, 4-foot seas by the time you get to Clarence Strait. And northwesterlies working across the outer coast around 20 knots or so with 6 to as high as 8-foot seas coming down the coast there on Tuesday. As we get into Wednesday, a little bit of a northerly shift, but remember, high pressure still in charge out across the western Gulf. And that means northerlies for everyone. 15 to 20 knots on the inside, 3 to 4-foot seas, and 6 to as high as 8-foot seas across the outer coast, 15 to 25 knots there with the highest waves and winds outside of the Dixon entrance there at 25 knots with an 8-foot sea. Tuesday in south central, light and variable winds. Probably a nice day at Prince William Sound and the northern Cook Inlet, only 10 knots there. East to westerly flow across Cook Inlet, 15 to as high as 30 knots over the Barrens. You can see that little bit of a shift there from southeast to more of a westerly flow coming in across the Shelikof Strait region, 25 to 30, and light westerlies there across the northern Gulf, 15 knots with a 5-foot sea. North and northeasterly winds coming down Cook Inlet tomorrow, still staying small, and then only coming up to about 10 to as high as 25 knots west of the Barrens. Southeasterly flow at 15 to 20 across the western Gulf, coming into Kodiak Island at 15 knots with a 6-foot sea on Wednesday. We'll hold on to some light westerlies inside and outside of Prince William Sound, 10 to 15 knots with a 5-foot sea in the northern Gulf. For Tuesday, around Bristol Bay, southeasterlies there up to 30 knots with a 7-foot sea. Remember, we're getting into that stronger flow of southerly wind at this point. This is going to be some very wet air passing over your neighborhoods. Southerlies across Cold Bay at 8-foot seas there, 9 to 10-foot seas across the Pacific coast, a 30-knot wind there. For Wednesday, really not a whole lot of a change. The winds may diminish a little bit, but looks like 5 to 6-foot seas on the Bering Sea coast and inside of Bristol Bay, and 9-foot seas across the Pacific coast, 20 to 25 knots from the south and southeast. Wind directions don't change very much, again, as you're kind of parked right under that weather system, and you'll be there a little bit. Same goes for areas in the eastern chain, anywhere from Atka to Unalaska. Winds are going to pretty much stay southerly for the next couple days. 25 knots in those regions, 7 to 12-foot seas, and then 13-foot seas as you get out toward Kiska and Attu with a west and northwesterly flow at 25 knots. For Wednesday, winds diminish in all areas, 15 to 20 knots it looks like, 7 to 8-foot seas across the Bering Sea coast, and 10 to 12-foot seas across the Pacific, and probably 8 to 11-foot seas on that west to northwesterly flow from Kiska to Attu once again. Here's the west coast, south and easterly winds again, bringing you warmer and wetter air, 25 to 30 knots as you get up toward St. Lawrence Island, 35 knots with a 7-foot sea. Southerlies around St. Paul and St. George with a 9-foot sea on Tuesday. That becomes 15 knots and 7-foot seas by Wednesday. We'll keep 15 to 20 knot winds coming all the way up toward St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, with a south and southeasterly flow going into the midweek. For Tuesday in the north, a southeasterly flow really for all areas, 20 knots across the Beaufort Seacoast, 25 to 30 knots from the Chukchi Coast into Kotzebue Sound. Winds pretty much all blowing the same direction. They're going to change a little bit as we get into Wednesday. Winds stay in the southeast for the Beaufort Seacoast and more of a southerly flow, pushing that warm and wet air across your villages there from Barrow all the way down toward Point Hope at 20 to 25 knots for Wednesday. Recapping tonight's weather, flood watches are posted for the northwestern Brooks Range, especially the south-facing slopes there. The Kobuk and Noatak Valleys should be watching this, and the south-facing slopes of the Seward Peninsula and the interior there, and that's also going to include the southern coastline. And for Nome, expecting on the order of about 2 to 3 inches of rainfall as we get into the midweek. So this is going to be a process that kind of stays put for the next couple days thanks to high pressure here in the Gulf and low pressure out across the west. The west coast is going to be soggy, melting and thawing as we go into the midweek. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.